Hello, I'm Dr. Bond. This is a Bond report. This one is called A Brief History of IOLs. An IOL is an intraocular lens. It's got the initials of it. It's a lens that's meant to be put inside the eye when you get rid of a cataract. A cataract is your own lens in your eye, a organ that has gone bad or opaque or clouded, and you're removing the clouded one and replacing it with what will be permanently a clear one. So that is an IOL. We begin at dawn we ride. I just like this slide. I like the look on the little guy here. And one other thing I wanted to start, these are the eagles that are in my backyard and have been nesting there for about 3 years. And my neighbor takes these pictures, and this is when they're hatching their first egg. We begin with Endicott Peabody said, the medical students they get, this is the son that's too lazy to work on the farm, too stupid for the bar, and too immoral for the pulpit, was what he got. Things I always liked that quote. This is my library at home. Quote a little Francis Bacon, reading maketh a full man, conference a ready man, and writing an exact man. Now this is somewhere in between there, reading and writing. Job security, you need to know what that requires later on. 3 things to provide yourself security as dean, like Endicott Peabody, football for the alumni, sex for the undergraduates, parking for the faculty. I just always liked that one. This is me getting older, and I use this Schopenhauer quote a lot. It's like you have been behind the conjurer's booth at the carnival and watching how the tricks are done a few dozen times, and you're behind there, and it's meant to be seen from the front and once, and you feel like you're wise to things. The eye, psalmist said, is the window of the soul. And there's different types of souls that's expressed in the different kinds of eyes. We sometimes act like the eye is the window of the soul is entirely a good thing. Maybe it isn't, The insurance is a sucker bet. This is going into practice. Early on, it was fine that people tried to keep up with things. Steady cuts and steady things over the last 10 years, it's been getting where you can't do business with that anymore. And so what winds up is the surest way, as Bonaparte said, in a bit of different situation, the surest way to remain poor is to be an honest man. This is the way that this goes. So we've got this economic twilight zone that you figure out, you ask them for explanations, and everything's emphasized with a way of what does this add to a bottom line for us? How can we cut this? How can we get the money out of this? Norm Macdonald sang it all, the dating game. That was a weird game show where the prize was another contestant. And the first thing Norm said was, talk about cheap. I'd never thought of it like that. Randall Tex Cobb says, they ask me if success is going to change me. I tell them I sure hope so. This is one of my favorites. But you never feel like you've arrived, that every year you're worried about what you're going to make and things. Today, we're going to talk about the art of medicine. This was a big change that occurred when I was a resident, and it was an interesting thing to see. The art of medicine, said Voltaire, is murderous and conjectural. Most of the knowledge of neurology comes out of war and the horrible injuries people get. And IOLs are no exception. These are called aphakic spectacles. Younger people, I operated once on a 1-week-old as a resident. He had white cataracts. You could see white pupils, and we had to be sure he didn't have a cancer behind that. The most common solid tumor before the age of 5 is called retinoblastoma, and it often occurs in both eyes, and it's malignant. It crawls up the optic nerve to the brain. You want to get rid of it. But the lens, which is what the cataract is in place, and it helps bend the light to what is called refract. Refract is to bend. And the lens bends the light. We didn't have anything to put in the lens's place, so people had to get these wild lenses. This was the state of the art, more or less forever, before the technology I talk about is going to come along. These are what's called aphakic spectacles. Your lens in Greek is aphakos. Aphakic means no lens. And here is one of these patients. I've got a picture of my 1-week-old post-op with her arms up over this chair. It's the cute, I guess, but there she is with her AFib, expects reading. And you want to do that early so you don't get some lazy eye, some amblyopia. It's a big deal in someone that age. Your more common cataract patient, of course, was an older lady here. But if you'll notice, these glasses, they magnify and they hugely distort around the edges. The other little diagram there, it's much more than that. To try to duplicate that is hard to do. But you're an 80-year-old, and you've got to see the world differently now. And you've got these spectacles of, say, +10 or +12. Naturally occurring farsightedness goes to about +3, +4 before you get into crazy. And these are +12. And these guys, the things magnify. The lenses also distort. The walls seem to come inward, and this is marked. This is not a little bit, but the walls are curved inward. And also there are edges to this where you can't see at all. It bends the light away from your pupil, and they get what's called the jack-in-the-box phenomenon, which is the little jack-in-the-box you see on there. Things don't appear until they pop into your vision very quickly and magnified, and this was called the jack-in-the-box phenomenon. Now, if you didn't do that in the old days, you put in contact lenses, aphakic contact lenses. They did not distort nearly as much. The brain would get it better, but you've got an 80-year-old with arthritis in their hands, and for the first time, they've never worn this, and you're going to fit these poor people with contact lenses. And this was the state of the art for 1,000 years. Along comes Harold Ridley in the Second World War. Now, the British, he's Mr. Harold Ridley. The British, if you're a surgeon, in the 1400s, I believe, might be earlier, the barbers did the bloodletting, which is why a barber pole has got the red and the white stripes. That's the blood running down the white dowel. And they did the bleeding and the surgery, and that was done by barbers. And so the MDs at the time, the doctors, said it's okay to start going to medical meetings and start educating yourself about medicine as long as you never call yourself doctor. So if you have a surgical fellowship anywhere that was the British Empire, and this is true today, you were Mr. So-and-so. So Mr. Harold Ridley, I have a lot of good friends. They're surgeons that are Brits, and they're, Mr. Arthur Cummings. I'm thinking of a plethora of guys here. And Harold Ridley observed from combat, and this was the British Hurricane and the Spitfire. They used a material that was called Perspex, P-E-R-S-P-E-X, and that's a compound called polymethylmethacrylate. And what that did was it did not excite any inflammatory response in the eye, unlike every implant everybody ever tried up to that time. And here you were, and the closest you were to getting like a pirate peg leg is you had to have your whole prosthesis outside the body. If you had anything in the old days, you try to put a peg leg inside a guy, for instance, and have that walk, that would reject. The body's immune system would not tolerate it. And here's Harold Ridley, and we have a material that he observed will not reject, placed inside the eye, and he correctly reasoned we could make lenses out of this. Now, this is an ad for Rayner, but this was the early thing. The 1952, the year I was born, issue of Ophthalmology, Mr. Harold Ridley described the introduction into the eye, the Perspex. This was a huge sensation. Now, he had some designs that didn't work out, and his early designs, he had put them back where the real lens is. This is actually a big thing. But I'm thinking of the medical meetings of the day. In this particular one, this is a surgical demonstration, but this is about what I've seen at medical meetings in the old-time things. This would be grand rounds of the type that I'm talking about. You had tiered seats, you had kind of a theater, and somebody'd come down here, or a group of guys would come down, and you would present cases, you would do other things. Now, you would think that this would be hailed as a great, wonderful, Dr. Ridley has devised a way to make an artificial lens. You would think this would be hailed by our establishment as the greatest thing ever, and he would be a hero. And the opposite was the truth. There was a guy, Sir Stuart Duke Elder, lived and worked there. He was a big, big deal. This is him. He'd written a series of 7 volumes that I had. I don't think most people ever read them, and no one I ever known has read them all the way through. And this was the ophthalmology of, the 1930s, 1940s, based on what those guys thought then, and was, up to date for the time, like they always are. Here was Dr. Duke Elder's, what he called a system of ophthalmology. And these guys were vehemently opposed to putting these things in. They'd never heard of such a thing. This is a foreign body inside the eye. If you put them in there, they will destroy eyes, if not quickly, over a great deal of time. They will erode things. This is terrible. This is horrible. And guys who do this are pirates, buccaneers, murderers, and Nazis. Right after the Second World War there, this is the most awful thing you can do. I wasn't taught that in the residency, but most of the academic guys that I ever knew were vehemently, violently, you were absolutely a murderer, a horrible guy if you advocating putting an implant in someone's perfectly good eye. Now, they weren't perfectly good. They had to wear those awful spectacles, or you have an old person trying to get some awful contact lenses. But that was the state of the art. So any suggestion was done the Jackie Child's way. The suggestion that you'd put this foreign body in the eye, this IOL, that was preposterous, egregious, outrageous. And anybody who backed that was an absolutely horrible guy. I'm a resident during this time from 78 to 81. This thing festered for about 30 years, and it was still raging when I was a resident. What kind of guy? My chief, Herb Kaufman, embraced that and thought that was going to be the new science. He just didn't think the designs were very good, that they weren't going to work out because the designs were wanting. They hadn't figured out how to do that. Harold Ridley really had kind of impractical designs. No one could tell. And these guys had violent opinions that this was a foreign body in the eye, that this was going to produce horrible trouble. If not now, then later. Why would you do it on even one person and destroy this person's eyesight? What kind of bounder, cad, reprehensible, awful person would knowingly take a patient who's trusting you and put this time bomb in their eye? And it wasn't necessarily a time bomb. It might go bad instantly. And it was thought to be that. Now, this was a violently held opinion. Now, there's a difference between your opinion and fact, as Clint Eastwood's Dirty Harry points out. There is a difference between fact and your opinion. Sometimes people point that out. Nothing, when you say, wouldn't this be a great thing to set that out? Nothing is so uncertain, said Livy, or unpredictable as the feelings of the crowd. And this crowd was very much against that. This was the academic guys when everybody was training. This went on for 20 or 30 years. You're getting people, this wonderful state-of-the-art aphakia with those wild glasses or these wild things for these older people, and you were stopping this other technology because that was just going to kill everybody. There wasn't a lot of science involved, and this wasn't seriously studied. Gee, let's put an ice pick in everybody's brain and see if that results. Well, everybody already knew that was a bad idea, so what was there to study? And who was going to line up to do this? And you couldn't in conscience do this on people. This was not, so there's no science. Let's get scientific. Are you a Gemini? And also there was just opinion. There was the Richard III Society in Britain. They found his body in a parking lot a few years ago. And they thought, gee, if we get to know this, he'll be better thought of by the British public. That had not proven to be the case. You don't really know much about other people. Why are they doing this? Steinbeck said that the best you can do is suppose another person's much like yourself. John Kennedy, after the Cuban Missile Crisis, was asked by Kenneth Scowcroft, what is the main thing you think you learned from this the day afterwards? And he said, Ken, I had no idea that there was so much bad advice in the world. So the bad advice of the ophthalmologic establishment was this is a terrible thing. The people who would consent to do this is a spawn of the devil. There is nothing good about this. This is a terrible idea. People wanting to do this are Nazis, war criminals, horrible. All it had going for them was it would work, and it was a very good idea, and it gave you much more natural vision. But the facts couldn't really be proven unless you got a population that's willing to do that. So the opinion began to build as people did small control studies and found that these intraocular lenses were going to be something good. Bismarck said it the best there. He said, friends die, friends drift apart, friends break up, enemies just accumulate. And so you have a growing population of ophthalmologists to begin to think maybe this isn't such a bad idea. Also, one of the main things that it didn't have going for it was it wasn't their idea. So they began to get morally indignant about someone who would do this as a bad guy. Moral indignation, a lot of the time, is jealousy with a halo, as H.G. Wells said. And withering glances, I remember they'd have meetings where you'd start to present things on IOLs, and the Norm Macdonald end, to go back to Norm Macdonald. Withering glances, they look at me the way real vampires look at Count Chocula. And they had all the answers. You read every journal. It was a bad idea. There were these awful people maybe starting to advocate these implants, and this wasn't on any kind of basis. This was the man who reads nothing all is better educated than the man who reads nothing but newspapers, President Jefferson. But substitute the word internet, we have that now. Now then it was papers and things you would read. It was more difficult for the patients to have the glasses and the contacts. Now it's kind of nothing and your natural vision comes back, if anything, much, much better. But then Thomas Aquinas, you're not necessarily bad. More difficult's not always more meritorious. Now, there weren't always a lot of complaints with things. You couldn't always figure that out. And Benny Hill said this, a comic, the fact that people don't talk about, you don't hear about defective parachutes. People don't come in and say, listen, my parachute was defective. What are you going to do about that? Because they aren't telling anybody much. And also, you had a factor of this. If you put an IOL in and something went wrong, everybody, the academic guys as a group, would testify against you. This was a terrible idea. This was experimental. There was nothing to experiment about. It was obviously a bad idea. And anyone who'd do that's Dr. Mengele. This just was just a terrible idea, and people who did it were terrible. And this was changing when I was a resident, but it wasn't gone. And you were still kind of shady. Now, we had a guy, I don't remember his name, and I wouldn't say it in any case. All I would read in journals with this guy is that LASIK, this is when LASIK was new, coming out of Columbia. LASIK was a terrible thing. You were changing the basic integrity of these eyes. This was going to be this horrible epidemic 5 and 10 and 20 years later. And you were ruining these eyes for the future. Maybe not now, maybe not tomorrow, but for the rest of their lives. Now, that didn't turn out to be true, but there's no way to do a thing and know what happens 20 or 30 years later, but it sure seemed good every year, and you'd see them every month and it looked the same. So, and it was just this mindless thing. Teach a parrot to say that, and you've got yourself this guy, So they already knew what the answer was, and you taught the parrot. So you should never have a problem in the belief that you'll find someone to pick you up. That wasn't it. And at a certain age, and this is certainly true in my case, you know that the worst is generally true. So you're thinking, well, gee, do I want to do this? I remember I was the first guy to do an implant at the hospital where I practice. I had done about 30 when I was a resident of the 350 or so that I did of cataracts as a resident. I did 30 implants under close supervision. They were coming in, and the consensus was changing because people were doing this and the patients were thrilled. And you were getting what was regarded as wonderful results. And this was starting to change, but it didn't change overnight. And there were people, a lot of the academics, never ever changed their minds. So basically, when you have trust the science with this medieval plague doctor here with the beak so that you won't breathe the air around these plague patients, trust the science was absolutely wrong. But as we lived out, as Aeneas Nin said, as you live out the confusions, they become clear. And it was clear from the gathering experience of people, but feelings were still very strong in the ophthalmologic field about you were putting a foreign body in the eye and you're going to wind up in hell. You're subjecting patients to this. You're going to ruin eyes. You're a terrible guy. That was real. And as the experience began to accumulate, as Yogi Berra said, you can't observe a lot just by watching. As it began to very slowly catch on in the fact that it was a huge advantage and you didn't have these distortions and these other problems, that was going to be a very, very good idea. Now, since people were used to something that wasn't wonderful, you don't know what you're doing until the last chapter. Hercule Poirot never tells you. You're not reading the last chapter. You're putting it out there hoping for the best. And you're a doctor, you're genuinely doing what you would have done on you as a patient. I have implants. And I mean, this was thought, you're doing something that you know, certainly in your experience seems to be very good, and the experience of people you know. So the truth began to come in there, and one of the things that delayed it was some of the early designs, and I'll get into that. So education never ends. You're being educated all the time, sometimes whether you like it or not. With a great lesson for the last, Sherlock Holmes says, surely we know what he's talking about there. But your education never ends. You're always looking for something to point you in a different direction. The real science, but nevertheless, those guys held out. I'm thinking of some academic guys, brilliant guys, people you're taught to admire, people you study under. In my case, that wasn't the case. He embraced IOLs and thought they were the real deal and good. So I had the advantage of that, but it was very frowned on elsewhere. And this was a thing I thought about certain things. You know, the war was over. Once they totally caught on and my generation came in because we'd seen what happened. It's not because we're any smarter than anybody else, but we'd had the advantage of seeing some courageous pioneers that had gone before us. For a long while, the war was over, but for a long while also the battle raged on, even though the war was over. You had some vociferous holdouts. This is a bad idea, this won't do that. As I said, we had that with LASIK. I'm thinking of a particular guy, and he never stopped. You never go wrong saying something bad's going to happen in 20 years. I mean, how do you can't be proven wrong. Now, this is Cassandra of Troy. And she's a Greek mythology person, and her basic thing, she predicted the fall of Troy, and she predicted that Agamemnon would be killed on the battlefield due to that fall of Troy. And she kept harping on this until Apollo, not Zeus in this case. A lot of Greek mythology, about 95% of it happens when Zeus gets horny, but in this particular case, this was Apollo. And she had done this naysaying in these negative conditions, and Apollo cursed her with the fact that she could see the future to a limited point. She could see the future, particularly she could see the bad things that were going to happen in the future, and she could predict them all she liked, but no one would ever believe her. That was her fate. You'll know the bad things that are going to happen, but no one will believe you, ever. Churchill said it the best, a real politician needs the ability to predict what's going to happen tomorrow and next week and next month and next year, and, once again, 20 years from now, and then be able to explain why it didn't happen. That's a Churchill that I really like. And the old guys were that. In critical and baffling situations, revert to your first principles, your simple action. What's been the case in your hands? Now, as we go through designs of things, the lifestyle lenses, this was a topic I'm going to do in one of the next talks. The design of Harold Ridley's concept, how this is going to be tolerated in the eye, how it's going to work, all these other details, the design of that is going to turn out to be critical, which people I guess understood at the time, but that was the main thing holding it back. It is proverbial in all surgery, general surgery, that when you got a complication with someone or they have trouble, you're married to them. They're going to be in a lot, you're going to get to know them, they're going to get to know you, and so we speak of getting married. And you'd think in those terms. Mamie Van Doren, and I've been married a few people I shouldn't have, but haven't we all? And you're getting married to these people. It comes out that, and a lot of the time, scared shitless. Gee, what's going to happen? What's going to happen? Now, Louis Ferdinand Céline, Death on the Installment Plan, the beginning of genius is that. And what you got to do is Marcus Aurelius, one of the great Stoics, Roman emperor. Closer a man comes to a calm mind, the closer he comes to strength. Thank you very much. Thank you for watching. Please watch further bond reports. Thank you.